I'm a little behind in getting the last 3 lessons up online, but I figured since we've all been here for the most part, that's really not much of an issue at this point. So I'll get to it probably tomorrow or Wednesday, sometime this week.
Well, after I read last week, I kind of figured out where you were going.
Not me.
I was out for part of the
I don't
time.
think like that.
Oh,
When
yeah.
I came back,
Yeah.
I figured it out what was going for.
So-
I'm there for your little fish of Sherlock and that.
That was the main thing of last week, which actually I'm going to be starting with that again this week. So as far as the introduction goes for this particular week, now I'll say this right now. I will be surprised if we get through all this material tonight. There's a lot here, and a lot more than I was really anticipating doing tonight. But when I kind of got into it, it was like, what?
Got into it.
Yeah, like what do I leave out? So if this spills over into the next week, that's fine. I mean, next week is just the cross, so it's not like there's a whole lot there, anyways, right?
Yeah, right.
I say that, with all the sarcasm in the world.
Yes.
So anyways, if tonight does spill over, we do have that final week that's titled Closing, that really has no purpose other than to kind of wrap up our thoughts and stuff on this particular material, so we can eat into that as well. All right, so as far as the introduction goes, the paragraphs there, the closing part of the narrative of the Gospel of John can all be seen as Jesus overcoming the imperialism of Rome. So one of the claims of the gospel news is that Jesus is the Christ, but also that he is the King of the world. So he gained this title in his resurrection from the dead, something we'll get into in lesson 11. But for now, let's look at how Jesus overcomes the Romans. So the Roman influence in the gospel can be seen similar to a 3-headed dog, which I have an example of.
That's
All
from
right.
Star Wars. Or, Harry Potter.
Well, I do not partake in any sort of devilish rituals, so
Sorcery.
Harry Potter's good.
I'm just kidding. I've read all the books. I've seen all the movies. So
I didn't want to read them.
Also in one of the, there was another one that I was in too.
I don't know, but you're never going to.
yeah. So
We'll get done for
he's
long
the
run.
3-headed dog's originally from some ancient story. So, but anyways, we can look at the gospel can be seen similar to a 3-headed dog. They are 3 fake facades or masks or characters, but behind all 3 of them is the same evil beast ready to devour Jesus, and that is Rome. So the 3 faces of Rome in the gospel are the high priest Caiaphus, Pontius Pilate, and the trial, and finally the cross itself. So this week we'll look at some literary issues prevalent in the gospel that make us believe the gospel has a Roman audience, at least not Jewish, and how Jesus overcomes Caiaphus and then Pilate. The next lesson will focus specifically on the cross and death. So as far as literary issues go, I stuck this in there probably more to expand upon the next time I do this, because I just did not have time to really do a whole lot here. So as far as the literary issues go, you've got the 2 examples there that John explains Israel, Palestine, and interprets Hebrew. All right. So even in our text tonight, we'll see an occasion where he speaks or writes something in Hebrew or perhaps Aramaic, and then he translates that into Greek. Like this is what this means, right? And then in other occasions, he explains Jewish festivals, right? So this was the festival, blah 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 blah, when the Jews did this, and then also, so I'm just kind of running through them briefly. He is able to give descriptions of Israel-Palestine that are necessary if you've never been there before. So, for example, when he talks about Jesus going to Bethany, well, we know that there are two Bethanies. And so he describes the Bethany beyond the Jordan, right? So he gives a qualifier there, so as to, say it's not the Bethany of the Lazarus story, and it's the one close to where. So when you look at the literary issues, and I was contemplating just going through them verse by verse, but again, we don't have time for that, I don't think. It just becomes very apparent that John, if he was writing to a Jewish audience that was in Palestine, those descriptors would not be necessary. And so that furthers the idea that John probably wrote this letter from Ephesus, and Ephesus being a Greek or a Greco-Roman audience, meaning of Greek European descent, right? And so they do not know the land of Judea. They do not know the land of Israel. And they have to explain some of those things. Or he has to explain some of those things to his audience. If you want specific examples of this, email me and I'll send you some verses to look at. And then the second thing there is Jesus rarely uses kingdom of God language. He in fact only uses it in 2 locations, but he uses it 3 times. And the first one is in chapter 3, where he's talking with Nicodemus. And then the second time is in conversation with Pilate, where he says, "My kingdom is not of this world," which is extremely different than, say, the Synoptic Gospels, right? So the other 3, where the phrase "kingdom of God" is everywhere. And so, kind of like last week when we looked at how often the word Jews was used in the gospel, compared to the other gospels, we should also take notice that John only uses kingdom of God just 3 references, as compared to the other gospels, which use it profusely. So John's reserving that particular title for key moments in the gospel story. It's more or less like his trump card, right? And tonight we'll see that he uses that as his trump card in his discussion with Pilate, so as to lay it down on top of Caesar and say, "This is greater than you." Speaking of which, on a side note, much of tonight's lesson comes from the book Greater Than Caesar, Christology and Empire in the Fourth Gospel by Dr. Tom Thatcher. So, if you want to read more about this particular topic, there's a few books out there. This is sort of an emerging idea within the last 20 to 30 years of Christian scholarship. So,
What was his last name again?
Thatcher, T-H-A,
Thatcher?
yeah, T-H-A-T-C-H-E-R.
Like Becky Thatcher.
Or Margaret Thatcher.
Huckleberry. I didn't speak English, I thought. Sorry.
So he was a professor of mine at Cincinnati Christian University. So he was one of my favorite professors. I don't think Mark liked him very much. So
I can't imagine the 2 of you liking different people.
so to be fair, he got Thatcher as Thatcher was starting. By the time I got there, he had 10, 12 years of experience. So there is a huge difference there. That makes a big deal. So those 2 literary issues show us that the audience is sitting outside of Israel, Palestine when they receive this gospel, which means that they are most likely Roman, Greek kind of people. All right. So the message, therefore, the message of Jesus being greater than Caesar or Jesus being greater than Rome is a very important message for John to get across. One that he does in a very unique fashion that is very different from his apostle counterparts. So, any questions on that particular issue? All right, let's move on. The first thing that we're coming to is overcoming Caiaphus. overcoming Caiaphus, which, by the way, I apparently misspelled all throughout this thing. So
Caiaphus.
yeah, it ends in AS, not US, but I have fixed that. I just fixed it after I printed off all your all's things.
we don't care.
So Jesus overcoming Caiaphus is more of an elaboration or furthering of the previous lesson where Jesus overcomes the Jews. So there, as a refresher, we presented the idea that they are stylized types, that they're there to visually make Jesus and his followers look like a hero. And there we got into the whole Sherlock Holmes example, right? So Sherlock is the hero of the story. Dr. John Watson is his faithful apostle, and then Scotland Yard, or the chief inspector of Scotland Yard, is the kind of like the Jew, right? He's there to make Sherlock look better. So he's kind of a bumbling idiot at times, and other times gets in the way. So and other times they're actually trying to arrest Sherlock. So certainly I think this illustration probably, at least this is what I've been able to come up with so far, best illustrates the role of the Jews in the Gospel of John. So looking at Caiaphas, who obviously is the Jews and would be represented in that title throughout the Gospel, overcoming Caiaphas, we must include everything that we discussed last week about the Jews in this as well. But specifically, we're targeting Caiaphas for reasons because he is the high priest that particular year. So Caiaphus... So Caiaphas is high priest, right? And there was this event at the temple shortly before Herod dies, where he's building this brand new, temple complex in Caesar's. Well, I'm sorry, to help make the Jews, to pacify the Jews, right? But he also has to appease Caesar. So he puts a golden eagle at the entrance to the temple, and to make matters sort of worse, right? So the temple had many entrances, and the one that we don't really know for sure, but we can probably take a wild, sophisticated guess in that it was the entrance that had I don't know if you've ever seen a city, the city landscape, what we believe it looked like. There was a bridge, right, that went from the temple up to the upper city. So this isn't hugely important, but so let's say this is the temple ground, the temple mount, right? You had the lower city of David down here, which is, and you have the Kidron Valley and the Mount of Olives over here, right? And the temple faces this direction. You have the lower city of David, which is where all the poor people lived. Okay, this was the original city that David constructed. Okay, and then you had sort of this middle level as it goes up a slope. And then you had the upper city, which is about right here. And this is where the Praetorium is going to be, right? Which is the setting of our particular scene today. It's where Herod's palace in Jerusalem is going to be, that Pilate actually takes and uses as his own home. But connecting the upper city where all the rich and aristocracy lived was this bridge that looked kind of like this, right? And it connected the upper class people to the temple so that they could have quick access without having to come and mingle with all these people. And there was another entrance right here.
So my Bible says it's the Wilson's Arch and Robinson's Arch, the stairs or the bridge. My little map there, it says there were stairs probably for the lesser elite.
Yeah, there was
that came from
stairs.
The lower,
mm-hmm.
That came from the lower city.
Mm-hmm.
And then the bridge came from the upper, it says.
Yep. So, anyways, over this entrance right here, Herod placed this golden eagle. Okay, and the eagle is obviously the sign of Rome and Roman imperialism. So this is obviously a big no-no for Jews with the whole, second commandment thing, no other idols, don't worship any other idols or anything like that. So this is more or less an idol set up on the temple grounds. And there was a uprising over this, not a very big one, but like 20 or so guys come and they climb up the wall and then they kind of hang down from it by rope or something, and they deface the golden eagle. And these would be like your young zealots, right? Because anybody in their 20s is just out of their mind. And I'm not in my 20s anymore, so. So these are your young zealots who are just fed up with Rome and all these other things kind of ruining their religion and their culture and their faith and all that. And so anyways, they all kind of get taken out and killed. And then there's this revolt that rises up because of it. And when that's all settled by Herod, he takes care of all of it. However, the high priest of that particular year is believed by Herod, because he's extremely paranoid, so we don't know if this is true or not. But Herod, being extremely paranoid, gets in his mind that the high priest was one of the co-conspirators of this particular event. And so he takes the high priest away and kills him, and he puts in his own high priest. And this starts a cycle of Herod, who then is later replaced by his son, who's then later replaced by Pilate. They just pick the high priest, right? Whoever they want. So we're singling out Caiaphus because of this little historical event where the high priest is no longer really a symbol of Judaism. It's more of another face of Rome. So are we all on the same page? So the high priest is no longer chosen by lot, which is what is supposed to happen, right? Of the line of Aaron. Now it's basically given to the highest bidder.
How did the Jewish people respect or not respect Caiaphus or any of those chosen ones? Because since they weren't really chosen by them, did they really give them much weight in their decisions? Or
they were never really chosen by the people.
No, yeah, they're never.
It wasn't. You didn't vote for them.
It would be like the chief priests getting together, and then they would cast lots, and the casting of lots was like the Spirit choosing who God wanted.
But I would still think that they would feel that at least that was like the tradition, and then here it's broken because government has stepped in. So I would think that at some level they would still feel a little.
That's why you had all those zealots.
Yeah,
that's why you had them.
Yeah. This was totally. They were not happy with this. And as the more and more you look at first century Palestine, Israel, the more and more you see that it is a very chaotic world. And the fact that there are revolts about every decade or so, with the whole political climate of Rome and the oppression and all of that from Rome, and just even when we've done the whole time between the Testaments study, you learn there's so much instability in who's in charge, because the kingdom just keeps getting handed over and over to all these other people. And so the people are like, who's in charge today, essentially. So, and then Pilate even goes in and he gets taken out for being too violent, right? So there is just so much chaos in the first century that Jesus grows up in. And when you start to even look at some of those events, then you begin to see just how messed up the world was, and really how Jesus' message was even more perfect for the day. So Jesus does mention some of the events that happen, like the tower falling over. He mentions a revolt somewhere else, if I remember correctly. So we know that, and then in the book of Acts, they talk about the people who hide their swords because they were assassins, right? So these were, it was bad.
Is that the Tower of Silence?
I think so, yeah.
Just trying to think.
I know it starts with an S. So, anyways, so Caiaphas is a more or less a chosen figure by Pilate, even probably, and so therefore he's really there to help keep the peace between the Jews and the Romans, and that's mainly his function. And we even see some of that when in the scene we're about to read in 11:47 through 54. So it's in your handout there. It starts at the bottom of page 58 and goes on to the next page. Somebody want to read that for us?
Therefore the chief priests and the Pharisees convened a council and were saying, "What are we doing? For this man is performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, all men will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation." But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all, nor do you take into account that it is expedient for you that one man die for the people, and that the whole nation not perish." Now he did not say this on his own initiative, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus was going to die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but in order that he might also gather together into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. So from that day on they planned together to kill him. Therefore Jesus no longer continued to walk publicly among the Jews, but went away from there to the country near the wilderness into a city called Ephraim. And there he stayed with the disciples.
Thank you. So, even there, he's trying to keep the peace between the Jews and the Romans, Caiaphas is. And this is like one of the few times he actually speaks in the gospel. And he's doing it because he's afraid that the Romans will come and take away the nation and the temple. So his whole point in trying to kill Jesus is to try and keep peace between the Jews and Rome. We have a couple discussion questions there. And verses 47 through 48 seem to express a particular emotion of distress and them being at wit's end. What is leading them to this desperate posture?
It's just that it's desperate. They're thinking if they can quietly get rid of him, that the movement will go away, just like Nicodemus said, or who was it that said, years ago this revolt happened and the leader died and it quietly went away. Well, they're trying to make the same thing happen.
Yeah.
If we get rid of Jesus, this movement will quietly go away.
Yeah.
And Rome will be satisfied. They were desperate.
That's an Acts.
Yeah, who said that? Was it Gamaliel?
Gamaliel, yeah.
So, couldn't remember, but...
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good example. If they get rid of Jesus, they get rid of the movement. Because they're even afraid of Lazarus by this time.
Right, yeah.
So, and what he represents. So, okay, so they're in a point of desperation because of the movement. What else might have brought them to this particular emotion of distress?
Well, they're very ignorant of who Jesus really is, or they're not wanting to accept who he really is. And so on the Roman side, they think he's going to try to overthrow them. And then on the Jewish side, the priests and things, they think they're going to be without a job because he's taking all the way. So he's a threat to everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't know what to do with this guy. And since he's one and they are many,
yeah,
just let's get rid of him.
Yeah.
And if he continues to be more than one by having followers, then there could be an overthrow of the government, and they certainly don't want that.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Any other ideas?
Well, they knew they were looking. They were looking for an earthly kingdom. That's where they were wrong.
Yeah.
And then they knew by the signs and everything that a lot of them knew that that's who Jesus was, but they were looking for the wrong kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
And they were looking for him to be the one that would set up a kingdom here, and they would be finally released from their oppression and Roman rule.
Yeah. So Jesus was not who they were looking for. And so, they're looking in the wrong place. And so even in trying to assess who Jesus is with their own understanding, they're certainly at wit's end. How about the very simple fact that Jesus is a nobody from Nazareth, and he's completely turning the world upside down?
And if he could do that, who else could do that?
Right. So there's these are the rich of the rich, the powerful of the powerful men, right, sitting down in a room, and they are worried about a man who came from Nazareth.
Well, and then the falsity of saying no other prophet has come from Galilee. Well, Jonah did, and there was another dude too that came from Galilee. I probably got it written down, but they even start spouting out things like that aren't even true.
Mm-hmm. So,
but when you're desperate, you start grasping at things.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
It doesn't matter.
Doesn't have to be true.
Look at things today.
One of the things that the person I interned under down in, his name's J.R. Carroll, he said, desperate people do desperate things. And while that's a very simple statement, I think there's a lot of depth to that as well. So yeah, I know, but that's where I heard it the first time. So that if you get to a point of desperation, you find yourself doing things that you never thought you would do. So here, question number 2. Caiaphas' solution to the Jesus problem is to put him to death by execution. Now I'll read. Somebody, if you could look up 732, 45 through 47. Somebody else jump to chapter 8, verse 20.
About 8:20.
About 8:59.
And somebody want to get 10:39?
Sure, if I can.
So Greg, if you could read John 7:32 and then 45 through 47.
John 7:32. The Pharisees heard the crowd muttering these things about him, and the chief priests and Pharisees sent officers to seize him. 45. The officers then came to the chief priests and Pharisees, and they said to them, "Why did you not bring him?" The officers answered, "Never has a man spoken the way this man speaks." The Pharisees then answered them, "You have not also been led astray, have you?"
Thank you. 8:20.
He spoke these words while teaching in the temple area near the place where the offerings were put in. Yet no one seized him because his time had not yet come.
8:59.
Therefore they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple.
10:39.
And again, they sought to arrest him, but he escaped from their hands.
Okay. Caiaphas' solution to the Jesus problem is to put him to death by execution, right? So we've just read all of those examples of them trying to arrest Jesus. What should the reader, that's us, think of this plan of Caiaphas in light of the text that we have just read?
Jesus is like Houdini.
Jesus is like Houdini, right? So
God's in control. If the time's not yet, it's not going to happen.
right, God's in control, right? So
Or he's Houdini, whichever.
Caiaphas comes up with this genius plan. Let's capture Jesus, arrest him, and put him to death, right? Yet, of all of the times that they've tried to do this, it hasn't worked. And yet, all the people in the room seem to think, man, this is a great idea. I wish we'd thought of that before. Oh, wait! We tried, and it didn't work. So, as a reader, it's like, okay, Caiaphas, you're an idiot, right? Because you've tried this before, it hasn't worked, and the only reason why it works this last time is because it's when God wanted it to be.
Yeah.
So, but if you're putting yourself in Caiaphas' shoes, right? You have to think like, I mean, what an idiot, right? This hasn't worked. Why would you think that this would work? Right? Now, obviously, we could go even deeper and say, well, God gave this plan to him, just like he gave him the words that he speaks of prophecy there, right? But on initial look, as a reader, we should come to that, if we are starting at the beginning of the gospel and reading all the way through, we should come to that and think, man, this guy just does not learn.
But the people, or I think, the people didn't help to make it work either.
Yeah, the guards.
At that time.
Wait, like what do you mean?
I mean, all of the people weren't against Jesus. Well, they could have stayed him. They could have kept him. They could have helped, but they didn't.
The temple guards could have. Heck,
Yeah.
they came back and go, man, this guy's really,
There's other people that had some kind of an idea about what was going on, but they didn't lay hold on him.
No.
And he wasn't working magic. It just says here was hidden when it said, but Jesus hid himself.
Mm-hmm.
He was hidden. How do we know? It doesn't say, but how do we know the people didn't help him? Somebody that
She said it, I didn't. I just made it worse.
All right.
that someone.
Yeah. No.
They're still looking for an earthly kingdom, and there's still people that feel that he is this person that's going to set up an earthly kingdom, and doesn't say that, but when you're going in and thinking about everything, you had to look at all possibilities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. My point is just that Caiaphus is trying to present a plan that's already been utilized before and it hasn't worked. So it's kind of like, and the only reason why it works this last time is because God allows it to happen. Now,
Because it's in the order of things then.
Right. So, question 3. In light of verses 51 through 52 of our particular passage, which say, now he did not say this on his own initiative, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus was going to die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but in order that he might also gather together into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. Now, in light of those verses I just read, should we expect this representation of Rome to have any real power over Jesus? Explain.
Well, Caiaphus kind of reminded me of the character of this. I lost the name. I believe it was Esther. The story of Esther, where her uncle was supposed to be killed by the
Haman.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So he had this big elusive plan of how he was going to kill him, and then at the end, he was, people around him knew that he was going to do this and he wanted to do this, but then right at the end, it turned on him,
Mm-hmm.
and he looked like a fool.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's kind of what Caiaphus is. He's got this big plan, and everyone around him knows his plan, but they're just like, okay, and he just keeps looking like a fool.
Mm-hmm.
So then, maybe some just don't help him. They're just like, okay, well,
But he still has to be careful politically in what he does, because when you get down to what they don't want to, he doesn't want Rome to relieve him of his duties, so that's why he gives up Barabbas instead of Jesus and offers up to try to let Jesus go. But that's not going to happen. But all along, he's probably not wanting to cause a row and then have Rome come in.
Sorry, I was thinking of the invisibility cloak.
But what happened to Caiaphus after Jesus rose? What happened to him?
Well,
Did Rome-
like historically speaking,
Yeah, like what happened to him?
we don't know. He dies.
Oh,
They found a box, an ortuary, with his name on it.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
And also Caiaphus is in this role of trying to please everybody. He's wanting to keep his role with the Jews, because if Rome does happen to leave, he wants to still be in a good place with all these devout
Sure.
Roman or Jews.
Yep.
So he's kind of playing this both rounds. I'm doing this for the good of the kingdom, Well, he's kind of
Has some ulterior motives as well.
for
Yep.
both ways.
Yeah. I think that one of the things that we can't let escape this particular scene, and really all of the scenes that we're going to look at, is this irony. All right, there is this, and John's irony is fantastic. There's the surface level story, right? The word for word account, but even underneath, there's like this. What we kind of talked about last week with the whole memory, social memory, and the counter memory, right? The subversion story that's underneath. That's being carried all along through it, right? So Caiaphus is more or less a pawn because he's the voice of God, but he doesn't know it, right? So there's an irony there, and what he is saying vocally sounds good for him politically, but in actuality, it doesn't mean that at all. It means what God wants it to mean. So even in that particular instance, there are two meanings to this one verse, right? There's the straight up story of Caiaphas saying, this man needs to die to protect Israel and the temple, right? But what John tells us right there at the very end, in the subversion aspect of it, is that, well, he wasn't saying this of his own account. It was actually God. And this is more or less what this means. So all throughout the Gospel of John, there's these dual meanings of the text. There's the simple story, or even how it happened historically, and then there's this, for lack of a better term, spiritualization of it, right? There's this deeper theological understanding of those events that John reinterprets, and this is one of those occasions. Now, getting back to this particular question, should we expect, so Caiaphas being this representative of Rome, to have any real power over Jesus when his own words are not his own but are of God's? I think the obvious answer here is no, right? So Caiaphas has no real power over Jesus. It's that he has the illusion of power, the worldly illusion of power, but ultimately we know that Jesus is in control of the situation.
Like, remember when you were referring back to the memory and how you re-look at a story from a different perspective?
Mm-hmm.
So what if we're reading it from sort of Caiaphas' point of view and how he thinks he's been in charge, but the reality is he was a pawn that the Romans used as a scapegoat, because really they were the ones making decisions, but they wanted him to believe that he was making decisions.
So like Rome was using Caiaphas as a pawn as well, is what you're saying?
It might have been a little bit in reality.
Well, you mean...
Because they switch back, go to Herod, go to Caiaphas, they go back and forth.
They wanted him to
Pilate.
give the plan to kill Jesus when really it was their idea, but they wanted him to say it. So then if it happened, it was his fault, not their fault.
Yeah, why don't you hold on to that, all right? We'll kind of come back to that idea a little bit. All right. So I've broken down Jesus' more or less trial before Annas, and I've cut out Peter's denial of Jesus because that's not pertaining to our lesson here tonight. So could somebody read that section, verses 12 through 32?
So the Roman cohort and his commander and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him and led him to Annas
Sure.
first. For he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Now Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it was expedient for one man to die on behalf of the people. The high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. Jesus answered, I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple where all the Jews come together, and I spoke nothing in secret. Why do you question? Question those who have heard what I spoke to them. They know what I said. When he had said this, one of the officers standing nearby struck Jesus, saying, Is that the way you answer the high priest? Jesus answered him, If I have spoken wrongly, the way you wrongly, testify of the wrong, but if rightly, why do you strike me? So Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas the high priest. Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas to the praetorium, and it was early, and they themselves did not enter into the praetorium, so they would not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. Therefore Pilate went out to them and said, What accusation do you bring against this man? They answered and said to him, If this man were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him to you. So Pilate said to them, Take him yourselves and judge him accordingly to your law. The Jews said to him, We are not permitted to put anyone to death, to fulfill the word of Jesus, which he spoke, signifying by what kind of death he was about to die.
Bob, could you look up Mark 14:53 through 65, please? So, we're going to have Bob read this passage for us, okay? So now let's follow the events, all right? So, the Roman cohort and the commander and the officers of the Jews arrest Jesus and bound him and led him to Annas first, all right? So we got going from the garden to Annas, however you want to say that. All right, and then from there, it says in verse 24, so Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. And if you are paying attention, Annas has the label of high priest earlier in that paragraph. So then they go to Caiaphas, who's now also been described as the high priest. So right there should cause you to go, huh? Right?
How many high priests do they need?
Yeah. So and then from there they go to Pilate. Annas is so in verse 19, the high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples. So the high priest is present there, but we know that they're at Annas' house. Then in verse 24, so Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So there are clearly two different high priests referenced in this story, Annas and Caiaphas. And this guy is sort of the reigning champ, okay? And it's likely that this guy used to be it, but perhaps Pilate or somebody took that away from him and gave it to Caiaphas. So, as is the case of...
Where does it say Annas was the high?
It doesn't. It's from context.
This says Annas was Israel's high priest from AD 60 to 15 and was deposed by the Roman rulers.
Mm-hmm.
Caiaphas, Annas' son-in-law, was accounted high priest from AD 18 to 36 or 37.
Yeah. So it's kind of like
high
priest
emeritus. Yeah.
So, anyways, they take him to Annas first, which is this is the only time in the four Gospels that we have this particular part of the story. Then it goes to Caiaphas and then to Pilate. Now, would you mind reading your particular passage that I asked you to look up?
And they led Jesus away to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes gathered together.
Hold on a second. So, just to be clear, we're talking about Caiaphas here, and this is a meeting of the Sanhedrin. Okay, so this is the official trial of the Jews for Jesus. Go ahead. Go ahead, continue reading.
On that, you mean just go on 54, and that was 53?
Yeah, all the way to 65.
Oh, okay. And Peter had followed him at a distance right into the courtyard of the high priest and was sitting with the officers and warming himself at the fire. Now the chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain testimony against Jesus to put him to death, and they were not finding it. For many were giving false testimony against him, and yet their testimony was not consistent. And some stood up and began to give false testimony against him, saying, We heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another made without hands. And not even in this respect was their testimony consistent. And the high priest stood up and came forward and questioned Jesus, saying, Do you make no answer? What is that these men are testifying against you? But he kept silent and made no answer. Again the high priest was questioning him and saying to him, Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? And Jesus said, I am. And you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. And tearing his clothes, the high priest said, what further need do we have of witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy. How does it seem to you? And they all condemned him to be deserving of death. And some began to spit at him, and to blindfold him, and to beat him with their fists, and say to him, prophesy. And the officers received him with slaps in the face.
Okay. So, so we've now read Mark's story of this particular event, which is Mark 14.
53 through 65 is what you wrote.
53 through 65. Okay. So, let me ask you this, all right? What is completely missing from the story in the Gospel of John?
Well, the Sanhedrin thing was in the middle, was at night, wasn't it? It wasn't even a legal Sanhedrin council.
No, it was not.
No, and so when they said everybody agreed, it was just their little probably a clique of people who had this plan. So the Sanhedrin, that's not in there in John.
It's not.
So that's one of the things that's missing.
Yeah, the entire case of Caiaphus is gone from the Gospel of John. Because it goes, Annas sent him to Caiaphas, and then like the very next time we pick up after the Peter story is that Caiaphas sends him to Pilate. Now, why do we think that's significant? Like, why is that a big deal?
Because when you're in front of one person, is what that made you believe. That's a different conversation than when he's brought in front of a crowd of people who are trying to come up with testimony against him. I mean, that's just a totally different situation. And if I'm accused of something and she comes to me, we might work that out. But if you bring 20 people in front of me, I'm probably not working that out. I'm probably just not going to be believed.
Okay.
Well, you missed the point in John's gospel also of what he was actually, what they actually accused him of was
Blasphemy.
I am.
blasphemy that he was God. It's not in John, but it's in Mark.
Mark, it's because he says I am.
Because that was what.
That's what got him killed, as far as they were concerned.
That was.
I just don't get it though. Why didn't they just put him on a boat and sail him out to sea if he thinks he's God? Why do they have to go through all this? If they think he's crazy, just
Because it's
put him
God's
on a
plan.
I mean,
Well, blaspheming is it is a death sentence. Yeah. So if you blaspheme God, it is worthy of death.
yeah, I
And
guess
he's
it's just
done
a
that
cultural
all
thing. 'Cause,
along.
I mean, we have people in our country
Well,
also
but
who
it's
think,
not
oh,
really
I'm-
blaspheming because he really is.
Because he really is.
I mean, they think it is because
Yeah.
they think he's doing it, but.
So yeah, there's this whole issue of blaspheming. Not to mention the witnesses, right? There's no issue of really witnesses in this particular instance here, and so when they come to Pilate, which we'll look at, is they really don't bring any charge against Jesus in the Pilate story.
They can't really find one
So
very easily.
we'll look at that.
Well, in the trial, this trial supposedly was not to be conducted at the time that it
Oh,
was.
no, it's illegal trial.
Yeah.
It was not to be
And
at
remember, in the Gospel of John, bad things are always happening at night. Bad things happen at night.
Light and
Right? So the whole dualism of dark and light. So Nick at night happened, obviously, at night. The trial happens at night. The day becomes dark for Jesus' death happens at night. So the whole night thing is pretty important in the gospel.
When in Mark
The light shines in the darkness.
it mentions Peter followed him, and then he sat with the guards and warmed himself at the fire. Is he part of that witness group? Or
Well,
why
he's-
is he here? Why is he in this?
He's not even in the building. He's outside.
Yeah.
In the courtyard.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he's trying
With the
to.
slaves.
He's just waiting.
He's trying to follow along and see what happens to Jesus, more or less, but he can only go so far. Yes, this would be. He was not in this particular event. Now, if you believe like the Passion of the Christ, I think that if I remember correctly, the doorway is open and Peter can like see in from a distance, what's happening, and then of course Jesus is leaving, and then the rooster crows, and then they make eye contact, and Peter runs away and sort of fallen from grace.
Molestations.
Question 5. What can we surmise from the fact that both Annas and Caiaphas are silent in these proceedings?
Afraid.
Well, I don't know if I'd say afraid, because it does say that the high priest questions Jesus, right? Which is referring to Annas. But we aren't given any specific words, right? So Annas technically has no voice, and Caiaphas has no voice in this event either, because the whole trial is skipped over, right, in the gospel. So what sort of significance can we draw from that?
Well, they may not have to do anything. They let the people. They want to let the people take care of it, and then.
Yeah, no, I'm not so sure, because in these two particular events, it's behind closed doors. There are no people. It's just the Jewish authorities and leaders. So there's a perfect opportunity for there to be a dialogue between Jesus and somebody, or even to see what they're saying, which is what Mark does, right? So we hear from Caiaphas in this particular meeting. But John gives them no words to speak.
Where is in John where it talks? Oh, here it is. What does he say? And who was? So what does he actually question Jesus about? I've always thought Thomas about question. Why question me and ask me? Those who heard me surely know. Why did he go to Annas in the first place? Why would he ever be in part of the equation if he's not the true high priest?
Mm-hmm.
Why did the Roman the temple guards and the Roman detachment, or if it was just the temple guards, go get out of the garden, and the first place they take him is to Annas, who is not the true high priest? What does he question him that is so strikingly that John needs for us to know?
Maybe it's one of those things like when my children come to me because they did something wrong, but they don't want to go to their dad. So they're either going to Annas first because they want to play this idea out about killing Jesus, but they don't want to go to Caiaphas because he's a pawn that's being used by Rome or something. So they're kind of like going in first with this.
But remember, it was Caiaphas' idea to put him to death.
Yeah, so.
But they don't want to go directly to him because he might actually act it out, but they're still maybe on the bubble of whether to go for it.
Oh, okay.
He questioned him about his teachings. The high priest questioned Jesus about it and his disciples and his teaching. And he says, I have spoken openly to the world, verse 20 of 18. I've spoken openly to the world. Why question me? Let them tell you. And that's when he gets slapped. So why did John put that in there? Why was that so important, that whole thing?
I think
And
that's
so
an
we
excellent
got
question.
Well, I'm asking you the question.
What do you all think?
It didn't matter if he explained himself or not. They just disregarded him and disrespected him regardless, so he could have sat there all night and explained and they would have still not wanted to hear it. I don't think they had any regard for what he really said.
Sure. I think you're probably right. The significance that we're trying to draw upon is the lack of, or at least that I'm trying to draw upon, is the lack of voice from these two leaders who, one, it was his plan all along to try and kill Jesus, and yet we are totally left out of that entire discussion in the Gospel of John. So, why did John leave that out? And then what she's wondering is why Annas? And then
why did he put that one in?
Why did he put that one in? And why are neither of them talking?
Well, it says on verse 19, the high priest then
questioned
Jesus
Yeah.
about his disciples.
But we're not given
and about his teaching.
Not any dialogue.
We're not given any dialogue,
From him.
any particular words.
But the thing we really, the way I look at it, I realize it's what the scriptures, the men that penned the scriptures as they were led by the Holy Spirit. It's just the fact that it's the way that they were supposed to be, that it was supposed to be written. There's enough in all of it coming together. If we read it, we can bring it together.
Sure.
And harmonize it.
Sure.
So it doesn't need to be in John's. There are just certain things that need to be there that the Holy Spirit gave him to write.
That's why I'm asking the Holy Spirit, why'd you put that in there? I'm just going to have so many questions right now, Lord.
So,
why'd you put that one in there?
A couple things. First off, that's a wonderful theological way of looking at the Gospels, and there's certainly no problem in harmonizing the Scriptures, which I think you learn even a whole nother level of Jesus' ministry by harmonizing the Scriptures. However, the Spirit did give John the particular message that we have before us, and I believe that it is a literary document that carries all the weight that the Spirit wants it to carry. However, it is also a masterpiece, right? So we should take notice of literary devices within inside of it. So when you look at the Gospel of John as just a unit and take the other three Gospels away. So, tonight is the only night, if you've noticed, we've gone to one of the other Gospels for a comparison. And that's because we need to look specifically at the Gospel of John. And when we do that, he's presenting a very particular picture of Jesus, right? Which we could argue gets distorted when you throw the other three Gospels in. And so my particular point in all of this is that the lack of voice from Caiaphus or the two high priests is very important to John's overall message, that of, particularly tonight, Jesus overcoming the Romans.
What about his audience he's preaching to? They don't care what the high priest said. They weren't necessarily, like we said, they were from Ephesus and all the surrounding plebes. That wasn't the audience he was writing to.
So it's not a Jewish audience, so why would they care what the Jewish authority had to say?
I'm just throwing it out
there.
there.
No, I think that's a very legitimate position to take.
Because we always have to take in consideration, context is king. Who is the author speaking to? His audience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I wonder too if the whole, going to Ananias and all that, and just the way that it all is, and it's not legal, the meeting wasn't legal, and all that. I think that whole situation just highlights the chaos of not just the world they were in, the culture they were in, of the political things going on, but it also highlighted the chaos of the religious group too. Because nobody knew what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody wanted to make a decision. Nobody wanted, his blood on their hands.
Yeah.
The whole thing was just like, nobody wanted, it was chaos. And so that whole proceeding just seemed like, let's just highlight how chaotic the world was,
sure,
including the Jewish section.
I think that's a good point.
Well, they never They never had anything
Like this happened
to
before.
kill. They never had anything to kill him for,
Right.
until he gave them the reason himself.
I am.
Yeah. I mean, Jesus is the one that,
Is in ultimate control, right?
yes, he signed his own warrant.
So why do you think? We've kicked it around. Now it's your turn. Oh, wise one. Help us.
Well, I mean, to put it as simply as I can, I have a speculation.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'd say I don't know, but it simply be to another point to illustrate the fact that Caiaphas and Annas are not the ones in control, and the lack of voice shows that they are, again, pawns in this particular story of Jesus walking to the cross. So it ultimately, you're right, it doesn't really matter what they say, but the lack of it shows that they almost don't matter, right? They're put there for a purpose, and they're carrying out their purpose, and we've already seen in the gospel that Caiaphas's mouth is not his own, it belongs to God, and so it's, it is what it is.
I guess I would never want to be, I would not want to end my life wanting to be regarded as one of them, as a pawn. You know what I mean? As someone who's straddling the fence, and that God just used me because I was there. You know? I mean, because it's like God used his words and his voice, but their lives were so on the fence between serving God and serving the government. You know what I mean? Like, I hope that I am not that type of person, that I am serving the world and serving God and
Sure.
just there on the earth.
When you go back, that's the way it was with Pharaoh, though.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
All through history,
Yeah.
he's used bad and good for his will.
I mean, you could look at Judas, and Judas takes on a whole different a whole different persona in the Gospel of John,
Satan
because
enters him.
It's that whole like warm thing, like
Don't
either
be-
hot or cold, but don't be warm. Well, they're warm. Like they're like.
which is
Ugh.
so. All right, let's move on, because we only got about 20 minutes left, and we haven't even gotten to Pilate yet. John 18:30 seems like a very ambiguous and vague accusation for someone they are demanding to put to death. 18:30 says. Somebody want to look that up real quick.
Here. If he were not a criminal, they replied, we would not have handed him over to you.
Right, so Pilate says, why are you bringing him to me? Why don't you deal with him by yourself or whatever? And their response was that. If he was not a criminal, we wouldn't have brought him to you, right? So that's the accusation, more or less, that they bring after their whole night of deliberating and trials and all of that. That's what they come to Pilate with.
Well, because blasphemy, Pilate could
Right.
care less about
Right. Right.
So-
He's just like take him out behind the barn. And
Well, the blasphemy is going to be rather important later on in the Pilate. Right, so the accusation of him committing blasphemy doesn't even come until 19 verse 7. At the end of the trial with Pilate, Jesus is presented as the king of the Jews, and the chief priest answers, we have no king but Caesar. So what does all of this seem to point out about the chief priests / Pharisees / specifically Caiaphas?
Turncoats. We don't have anybody else but Caesar. They just denounced God as their king.
They did.
They're trying to find favor with the rulers so they can get what they want, because they're showing that they are aligned with Caesar, and so we need you to do this because we cannot put him to death, and that's what they want so badly that they're willing to throw in with Rome.
Sure.
That's the only way we're going to get it done, so be it.
So the fact that that's the only way that they can get it done is to throw their lot in with Rome, what does that tell us about their own power over Jesus?
Well, they don't have
They don't have any.
They don't have any, right? So in the
think they do.
in this particular lesson, remember these whole series of lessons is Jesus overcomes the Jews, the Romans. So Jesus has now overcome Caiaphus, right, the high priest, the chief priest, because they do not have the power to put this man to death, right? So they must appeal to Pilate. So in our little check box of people that Jesus has overcome, we can put one next to Caiaphus. Because Jesus has proven that he has power over Caiaphus, not Caiaphas over Jesus.
And they put Pilate's neck in the rope because he's just confronting him. So are you going to allow him to say that he's king, or they put Pilate in a spot of. We're getting to Pilate. Go on. I'm sorry.
So now that we have thought through how Jesus overcomes the weak, Caiaphus, and high priests, the first head of the Roman beast, let us now look upon the second. While John's account of the Sanhedrin hearings is only about half the size of Mark's, his Pilate trial is 3 times longer. So Pilate is clearly an imperial figure in the gospel, and Jesus' most sustained interaction with a Roman in any of the gospels. This conversation between Pilate and Jesus should give us great insight into Jesus' view of empire and how John sees Jesus overcoming Rome. Now, let's see. We got about 15 minutes.
You never have said why these little asterisks or anything.
What little asterisks?
Well, right before lead.
Oh,
There's one over here too.
The NASB changed the tense of that particular word from active to past tense. So that's what that means. And I just copied it from Bible Gateway, so that's why it's still in there. Let's go ahead and.
Caiaphus, right?
They did. It's amazing, right?
Yeah.
All right. So let's go ahead and read, and maybe perhaps one person takes a paragraph, and we'll just kind of go around the room, right? So, Elder Thompson, if you wouldn't mind starting us out.
1828. Then they led Jesus from Caiaphus into the praetorium, and it was early, and they themselves did not enter into the praetorium. So they would not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. Therefore Pilate went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered and said to him, "If this man were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him to you." So Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him according to your law." The Jews said to him, "We are not permitted to put anyone to death, to fulfill the words of Jesus which he spoke, signifying what kind of death he ought to die."
Therefore Pilate entered again into the praetorium and summoned Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus answered, "Are you saying this on your own initiative, or did the others tell you about me?" Pilate answered, "I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests delivered you to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting so that I would not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm." Therefore Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say correctly that I am a king. For this I have been born, and for this I have come into the world to testify to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?"
And when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, "I find no guilt in him, but you have a custom that I release someone for you at the Passover. Do you wish that I release for you the king of the Jews?" So they cried out again, saying, "Not this man, but Barabbas." Now Barabbas was a robber.
Pilate then took Jesus and scourged him, and the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and put a purple robe on him, and they began to come up to him and say, "Hail, King of the Jews," and to give him slaps in the face. Pilate came out again and said to them, "Behold, I am bringing him out to you, so that you may know that I find no guilt in him." Jesus then came out wearing the crown of thorns and a purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." So when the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, saying, "Crucify, crucify." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and by that law he ought to die, because he made himself out to be the Son of God." Therefore, when Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid.
And he entered into the praetorium again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, "You do not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you, and I have the authority to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no authority over me unless it has been given to you from above. For this reason, he who delivered me to you has the greater sin."
As a result of this, Pilate made efforts to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, "If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself out to be a king opposes Caesar." Therefore, when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation for the Passover. It was about the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." So they cried out, away with him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." So he then handed him over to be crucified.
Okay, so at the outset, John explains that the Jewish authorities are unwilling to enter the Praetorium because they wish to remain ritually pure for the Passover feast. We talked about this a couple weeks ago, right, when we were talking about the timelines. As a result, Pilate must go back and forth between Jesus inside and the Jews outside. Need my other page. This gives an oscillating structure to the text that matches his internal expression to the struggle taking place within his soul. For his certainty of Jesus' innocence increases at the same rate as does the political pressure forcing him to condemn Jesus. Now, the story of Pontius Pilate and the trial scene in the Gospel of John is rather fascinating to break down and look, which I have done for you in paragraph form, and there were little lines next to it, and you'll see what those lines are for in a second. But essentially, the whole story takes place in a chiastic structure, or chiasmus. Now, anybody remember what a chiasm is from all of our discussions from Genesis a year ago?
Yes. It has to do with like A, B, B, A to the main point.
Yeah.
It's like
English lesson parents just have a
D is
structure
the
of a
main
letter.
point.
Yeah. So more or less, you would look at this. You have A, B, C, D, C prime, B prime, A prime.
yeah, that's it.
All right, and it's the story works in itself, and then it works itself outwards, using a lot of the same ideas or even words or phrases that were used in these preceding lines. They are then reused in some way down here as well. And typically, the main idea is in the middle. That's not always the case. Sometimes it's at the beginning and at the end, and sometimes there is no specific middle. Sometimes there is no D. It just goes A, B, C, C, B, A. And we see this most in like the Psalms, Old Testament literature. It's just a style of writing that they would be memorable for them, right? So the entire story of Noah is one long chiasm structure. It goes all the way out to P, and then it works itself back in on itself. So it's a poetic feature to tell a story.
Memorization, which
Yeah.
is how they.
Yeah, helps you remember the story. So, anyways, here's the chiastic structure of the scene with Pilate. And you notice it's all dependent on the outside-inside scenes, right? However, you notice some common themes that happen in these particular stories. The Jews demand Jesus' death. Pilate then enters the praetorium, asks Jesus about his kingship. And then he steps back outside. Pilate declares Jesus is innocent. He goes back inside to beat the heck out of Jesus. Then presents him back outside. Pilate declares Jesus to be innocent. Goes back inside. Jesus says his kingdom is none of this world. Steps outside. The Jews demand Jesus' death. So you can see there is this flow to the story. So if the scourging happens here, right in the middle, then that kind of tells us that perhaps this is an instance that John wants to bring to our attention. And also some other things we ought to know is that in all of the other accounts, you have the trials, and then you have the scourging, and then you have crucifixion. So in here, you have more or less trial, scourging, trial, and then the crucifixion. So like the trial continues. So John is giving us a lot more detail about what's happening here. And so, I mean, we could go into this a whole lot. Now, we've only got 5 minutes. So here's what I propose. Is that we're at a good stopping point. And then when we come back next week, we'll pick up and go through each individual part of the chiasm and draw out some points there that are important, and then move directly into the crucifixion scene and how Jesus overcomes the cross. So, are we all good with that plan?
Mm-hmm.
So this is more or less Jesus overcoming the Romans, part 1.
I was just looking up like real quick because, you know, the whole idea of this, of Jesus claiming to be God, and you know, to us, we just crazy people in our world that do that all the time. So anyway, I googled like who else claimed to be God, and no one did. Like even Buddhism and Hinduism, they don't claim to be God. They just
Yeah.
claim to be a prophet. So no one does. No one claims that. And back then.
Back then, yeah.
Back then, but they did.
There are some crazies now that.
Yeah, there are, but back then nobody did. So that was truly like a big deal.
Well,
Caesar declared himself
yeah,
God.
yeah, and that's going to be one of the things that we talk about. Is
He was divine, he thought.
and it was specifically Caesar Augustus.
In Sunday school, when
No, what we may have talked about in study group.
was it?
But
No, it was
nowhere,
Sunday school.
not even today, do they do the attestations. I mean, the credibility is not there. That's
I meant those
the
years
thing.
between the tests.
Yes, we did talk about that, and Antiochus the third, Epiphanes, Antiochus the third, called himself God. That's what Epiphanes means, is God with us. And then, so that was around 160 BC.
The pig on the altar thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah, that was it.
So
And then-
we're gonna fill these in next week, these lines,
Well,
what those mean?
those lines I've just put there for you to mark A, B, C,
Oh, that's what this
D.
is then.
Yeah, so you
Okay.
can go back and transcribe that onto there
Okay.
for us, because we'll be jumping back and forth between that page and the pages that follow. So let's go ahead and break And Caesar Augustus also claimed to be son of the divine because Julius Caesar was made divine when he died. And so he put on his coins, Son of God.
No.
Yeah.
But they didn't kill him for that.
Well, no, he's Caesar, so...
Only the Jews had a thing about
Oh.
saying you were God,
Yeah,
remember?
and Pharaoh also
They
claimed
didn't
to be
care. Pharaoh was God.
to be God. So, of the major religions that exist today, you are right. None of them claimed to be God except
Just saints.